Hello, everyone. Happy Florida Native Plant Month. We're really pleased to be in session 2 of our Great Florida Riverway Florida Native Plant Month series. I would like to introduce to you our Policy and Legislation Chair, Eugene Kelly.
Our speaker today, Thomas Hochter. Some of you might be familiar with him because he has been a regular speaker at Florida Native Plant Society conferences. He's been a keynote speaker at a couple of those, I believe, over the years. He is a member of the faculty at the University of Florida, a research associate professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture. That might sound like a bit of a reach for relevance to what we do, but it fits in perfectly with the work that he does. Just to give you a little of his educational background, he received a Bachelor of Arts degree in History and Science from Harvard University. Then he made the move to Florida, where at the University of Florida, he received a Master's of Science in Forest Resources and Conservation and his PhD in Wildlife Ecology and Conservation. I would note that he studied under Larry Harris, who many of us recognize as one of the founders of this discipline we now call conservation biology. So he has been in the thick of this science ever since it became recognized as a particular category of biology. He's an expert at using GIS to answer some of the most important questions surrounding how to conserve biodiversity. And he has used those skills going back quite a few years now, back into the 90s, I guess it was, to develop the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, which is really the father of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. He has also been instrumental in developing CLIP. That's an acronym for the Critical Lands and Waters Identification Project. These are data sets that have really been fundamental to guiding land conservation throughout the entire state. So I can't think of anybody better to be talking about the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So thank you for joining us, Tom. Take it away.
Thank you, Gene, for that introduction. I would also mention a couple of things. Introduction, Gene covered a lot of ground. I'm also the director of the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning in the Department of Landscape Architecture. So we do a lot of biodiversity ecosystem service work related to both GIS modeling of priorities for protecting biodiversity, ecosystem services. We also are working more and more on climate change, as you might expect, and resiliency in terms of coastal ecosystems and migration away from the coast for wildlife and for our natural systems, but also thinking about flood protection in inland areas like we saw with Ian just in the last few weeks. So we cover a lot of ground in the work that we do at the center in our department. I have been at the University of Florida since 1989. The very first GIS project I was ever involved in was the Cross Florida Greenway. That was back in 1990 and 91. Where I was working with faculty in the College of Design, Construction, and Planning, Peggy Carr, and almost all of you know the Carr name. She was one of the leads on that project, and Paul Zwick, a GIS expert from the Department of Urban Regional Planning, were leading the UF effort to help the state figure out how to transfer the Cross Florida Barge Canal from federal ownership to state ownership, which was a federal law that passed in the late 1980s. And we looked at the Cross Florida Greenway as a wildlife corridor, but it was impossible not to also talk about potential Ocklawaha River restoration. So even though I was just a master's student at the time, I jumped right into the fire of should the river should be restored and why, and what was the ecological case for it. And I've been involved in ways since then for the last 30 years in some aspects of Ocklawaha River restoration. But what we're going to talk about the river system itself and the importance of restoration for habitat for focal species and other very specific things. But the overview message of this presentation is the fact that restoring the river, getting rid of the Rodman Pool and partial restoration that would restore thousands of acres of floodplain forest has a direct effect, positive effect on protection and function of what are called the Florida Ecological Greenways Network and the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And we'll keep moving. So if you don't know what the Florida Ecological Greenways Network is, I think most of you do. Most of you probably know what the Florida Wildlife Corridor is. That's where we're going to start after we talk about the Ocklawaha again a little bit. So most of this presentation is about the fact that there is this statewide corridor system called the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. And this newer thing, the Florida Wildlife Corridor, is based on the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. I'll explain that relationship here in a minute. But the Ocklawaha River is crossing the Ocklawaha River is an important part of protecting a very high priority statewide corridor. But the river itself, all the way from its headwaters in the Harris Chain of Lakes, and then to the northeast and east until it ends in the St. Johns River, is in and of itself an important wildlife corridor, a very important ecosystem system, a very unique ecosystem with a lot of natural communities that are actually unique or great examples of natural communities that are rarer elsewhere. And restoring the river, the lower part of the river affected by Rodman Reservoir, would have a great positive effect on the corridor, animal movement, habitat diversity, habitat restoration along the entire river system from the Harris Chain of Lakes all the way to the St. Johns River. And so breaching the dam is a big part of restoring the river itself, that river ecosystems in the watershed, as a corridor as well. So why is the Ocklawaha River Basin a critical part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor? Well, it happens to be in what we call a critical linkage, a highest priority within the Florida Ecological Greenways Network and the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So most of you know what the FEGN is, or you've seen me present on the FEGN, maybe more than once, but some of you may not have. So I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to understand what the Ecological Greenways Network is. It has been around for a long time. Starting in 1995, I started another project when I was a PhD student working with the same folks I mentioned already, Peggy Carr and Paul Zwick, to work with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to identify a state greenway system that would be both a ecological network, the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, and a trail system. And that process started in 1995, where we started using geographic information systems. And I focused on to identify those two subsystems. And of course, I focused on the Ecological Greenways Network. Other people worked on the Trails Network. And after we did the initial identification, the state passed a Florida Greenways Program law in 1997. So some of you may not know that there's an entity called the Office of Greenways and Trails, which is part of the Florida Park Service in the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, that oversees that program. Now, they're often focused on the trails portion of the plan, but the Ecological Greenways Network is still part of the state's official Greenways plan. The Ecological Greenways Network identifies the best opportunities to connect large conservation lands for both biodiversity and ecosystem services. So there's a lot of public and private conservation easements that are protected from development that are really important for protecting biodiversity and ecosystem function. Some of those, we can't necessarily functionally connect all conservation lands in the state because some of them are in coastal areas or in other areas where there's a lot of development. So they have been effectively and functionally isolated. But where we can, we want to protect protect existing, or in some cases restore functional ecological corridors connecting all the larger conservation areas all the way from the southern tip of Florida north to Georgia, and then west to the tip of the Panhandle. So that is the primary purpose of the Ecological Greenways Network. It is part of this state plan, which I just mentioned. And functionally, the FEGN has primarily been used to help inform the Florida Forever and also the Rural and Family Lands Protection Programs, as well as a data layer that's used sometimes in land use planning to identify the most important large intact landscapes across the state. Over the last 20 plus years, the Florida Ecological Greenways Network has been updated a number of times. We finished an update for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection a year ago. So this is the most recent map. The dark greens that you see are existing conservation lands that are statewide, that are connected to the Ecological Greenways Network. And then you can see that there are 5 different colors. So we've prioritized the private lands within the Ecological Greenways Network. And the P1 or critical linkages are that dark blue. Then the next lighter blue is P2, all the way down to P5. So you can see that if you just look at the P1 and P2 areas, that subset of the entire Ecological Greenways Network does actually run all the way from Everglades National Park and Big Cypress National Preserve north to Ocklawaha National Forest through the South Central Florida region. Then there's the O-to-O corridor that connects Ocklawaha National Forest to Osceola National Forest, and then corridors that go west connecting Apalachicola, Eglin Air Force Base, and other larger conservation areas across the state. For the last 10 years, there's been an entity called the Florida Wildlife Corridor. It's both a vision, but also an entity because it's now an NGO that has tried to publicize the fact that we were trying to protect this thing called the Ecological Greenways Network, and to convert this sort of complicated or wonky name of an FEGN into a vision that people could understand. And that's the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And so the Florida Wildlife Corridor started as a vision. It was a private effort by an NGO, not officially established as a public program, at least not for the first 8 years or so. And our definition, I've worked with that group of people since the inception of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. We started by being focused on critical linkages and priority 2 areas. And more recently, we felt that priority 3, at the very least, those top 3 priorities should be part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And most of you probably know a year plus ago, the state passed a law making the Florida Wildlife Corridor a conservation priority for state government. And it is technically defined as the Florida Wildlife Corridor is the top 3 priorities in the Ecological Greenways Network. So what this map is showing you is the grays are conservation lands of various types. The dark green are the portions of the Ecological Greenways Network that are currently part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. The lighter green are other parts of the Ecological Greenways Network that are not technically part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. Now, my job is to try and protect all of the priorities in the Ecological Greenways Network. It just so happens that for the moment, at least, the state has defined the Florida Wildlife Corridor as those top 3 priority levels. One of the things that you'll note, we'll get into more detail with this, but here's the Ocklawaha National Forest, Osceola National Forest, and between them is Camp Blanding, a military site that's really important for conservation. And this is the Ocklawaha system. So that's the Harris Chain of Lakes going north along the northwestern boundary and northern boundary of the Ocklawaha National Forest. And you can see that almost all of the Ocklawaha River Basin, where it's not public or existing conservation lands, is a dark green. It's part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So we prioritize the Florida Wildlife Corridor, the Ecological Greenways Network, for lots of good reasons, including the fact that there's over 11 million acres of unprotected private land in the Ecological Greenways Network. We know that development is happening so quickly in Florida, and the potential conflict between that development and protection of wildlife corridors is such that we know we're not likely to protect all 11 million acres, that we're going to lose some of it to development. And to help with land protection efforts for programs like Florida Forever and other programs, it's important to prioritize. If you could only protect certain areas, that's all you can get. What are the areas that are most important to protect? So that's why we have the 5 priority levels, and we do the highest priority, which we also call critical linkages, are all there. They are the highest priorities. If we could just protect those, we would have a minimally functional corridor network across the state. So those are legitimately our highest priority or focal areas. And this map is breaking up. So now you're just seeing existing conservation lands and that top priority class. So we're not showing any of priority 2 through priority 5. And we've broken up each of those into project areas. And you can see that Odo corridor, the Ocala, Osceola, or Osceola to Ocala, whichever you prefer, is one of those critical linkages in the state. Zooming in a little bit, this map doesn't show you an important factor that the Odo corridor has in its favor, but I'll mention it here in a minute. This is zooming in, where now the greens are existing conservation lands of various types. And this is the Odo corridor. The Odo corridor has existed as a named project longer than any other critical linkage in the Florida Wildlife Corridor in the FEGN. This is a project that we started doing with the Office of Greenways and Trails, we being the University of Florida. Also, what used to be what is now Florida Conservation Florida, their previous entity or version worked on creating new Florida Forever projects that would make the connections between Ocala National Forest and Camp Landing, and then Camp Landing to Osceola National Forest. So what this map doesn't show you is this is the only critical linkage in the state that at least a minimally functional corridor would be protected by protecting existing Florida Forever projects. That means the landowners have already been contacted. They've agreed in principle that they would be willing to sell the development rights to protect their land in perpetuity. We just need the money, enough money in Florida Forever to accomplish that goal. Now, there's tens of thousands of acres in Florida Forever projects within O2O, so it's going to take a lot of money. But the point is we already have the existing projects in place. We need the money to protect them. So that's a big advantage that O2O has over anything else. There are other connections that are important potentially that go from Ocala National Forest to the west and to the east, but we're primarily, for this example, focused on this Odo corridor going north from Ocala National Forest and then northwest from Camp Landing to Osceola. So this zooming in a little bit more, where you're now seeing FEGN P1 through P3. So that's the Florida Wildlife Corridor. That's that brighter green color. The dark green are existing conservation lands. And now we're seeing the Ocklawaha River, as well as it's partially underneath this arrow, but the Rodman Pool or the reservoir. And you can see some of those other connections that I just mentioned, that this is the part of the Cross Florida Greenway that unfortunately is the most fragmented and developed. It goes to the Ocala Bellevue area. But in theory, at least, there is almost continuous public ownership here. There is a marginal wildlife corridor that we've demonstrated some animals using it to go from the Ocala to the west coast, the Withlacoochee Basin, the west end of the Cross Florida Greenway. Other parts of the Florida Wildlife Corridor include these timberlands to the east of the Ocala National Forest. But you can see that we're also interested in a corridor that goes to the northwest, that the Ocklawaha River transects or goes through between the Ocala and southeastern Alachua County. This is part of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, but the highest priority corridor, because of its width, distance, and conservation lands it more directly connects, the critical linkage is this part that goes right through the area that the Rodman Reservoir is, and also, of course, the barge canal, the portion of the barge canal that was built connecting Rodman Pool or the reservoir to the St. Johns River north of the historic channel of the Ocklawaha River. So this is zooming out a little bit more, and you can see bigger scale, this connection across Florida Greenway, which is not as important because we don't think it's going to function very well as a wildlife corridor, although it's still part of the Ecological Greenways network. This priority 3 alternate corridor connecting the Ocala National Forest to the western part of Camp Landing, but then the Odo corridor. So all that green is land that's in the corridor, but is unprotected currently. A lot of it is Florida Forever projects. Not all of it, but quite a bit of it is in existing Florida Forever projects. So you can, once again, now that the arrow's gone, you can see a general representation, although the river is obviously wider than it is in reality. That's an artifact of GIS maps. But again, we can see Rodman Reservoir and the fact that it sits and the canal sit right in the middle of this corridor. One of the facts is that the Ocklawaha River is the largest tributary to the St. Johns River. It's a very important freshwater source. The dam and the reservoir actually have a negative influence on that. There's obviously evapotranspiration that occurs when the water's sitting in the pool. So we're not as much of the water from the Ocklawaha River reaches the river, the St. Johns River, as it used to. And that has it is a detriment or an impact on the ecological integrity of the lower part of the St. Johns River. And we know that the Ocklawaha River Basin, and specifically the Ocklawaha River area, the habitat surrounding both the intact parts of the river or relatively intact parts of the river and the reservoir, are very important for protection of ecosystem and biodiversity priorities. These next three maps that I'm showing you are all from the CLIP 4.0 database that Gene mentioned in his introduction. This is actually the aggregated priorities, which is the combination of all biodiversity and surface water resource protection priorities. The darker greens represent highest priorities, and as you get to lighter is lower priority. And you can see that parts of the Ocala National Forest are obviously very important, and the area is centered right around the river, very important for both biodiversity and surface water resource protection. And especially riverine swamps, floodplain forests, and the interactions, the juxtaposition between wetlands and specifically wetland forests and upland forests, really important for biodiversity in this region, which we'll get back to in a minute towards the end of this presentation. Some of the specific data sets, more specific data sets as part of CLIP 4.0. This is the biodiversity layer. So the layer I just showed you is all ecosystem service and biodiversity protection priorities. This is now just showing you the biodiversity priorities. These darker browns are the highest priority, but the pattern is the same. You can see that the Ocklawaha River Basin, when you get specifically around the river, is really important for biodiversity conservation. That includes data from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, which identifies what they call strategic habitat conservation priorities for a set of focal vertebrate species. It includes rare species habitat priorities from Florida Natural Areas Inventory. It includes underrepresented natural communities, which I think Gene's going to talk about a little bit more in just a minute. And then one of the things that we do, the Ecological Greenways Network is actually the product of many different models. So we're taking a number of data sets, including specific types of connectivity, to identify the composite Ecological Greenways Network. And this is one of the connectivity models that we use to identify or delineate the Ecological Greenways Network. We call this xeric habitat connectivity, where it's looking at opportunities for functionally connecting our xeric natural communities, including sandhill scrub and scrubby flatwoods, as well as, to some extent, depending on the soils, upland and mesic longleaf pine forest, with compatible soil areas that are still rural. So all those orange areas that you're seeing are important xeric connectivity areas. You can see the river sits right in the middle of this, and the reservoir, particularly, that there's a ridge in the Ocala National Forest to the south, there's the trail ridge to the north, and that you have these areas of important xeric habitat both to the north and south of the river and the reservoir. So now I think I'm handing it over to Gene and Valerie to cover the next set of slides.
Thanks, Tom. And it's fortuitous you were highlighting those xeric community connections there. What I'm doing with just a couple maps that I've prepared, I wanted to really highlight how restoration of the Ocklawaha by draining the Rodman Reservoir will really enhance the Florida Wildlife Corridor. In particular, that O to O segment of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So forgive me, this looks a bit like a Jackson Pollock painting, a little cacophony going on there. So just to show you the points I'm really trying to make, I've that big area of red labeled Ocala National Forest. I've used red here to distinguish scrub habitat, and the various shades of green. That bright green is Mesic Flatwoods. The darker green is Sandhill, and there are some scattered areas of scrubby flatwoods, that orange. And what I'm using here is another one of those data sets that's used to establish land conservation priorities, the underrepresented natural communities. It's part of the Florida Forever Conservation Needs Assessment, as is the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, what DEP uses to help identify land conservation priorities. And really, when we talk about the Florida Wildlife Corridor, it's got the word wildlife in it, and we are the Florida Native Plant Society. So my purpose here is to make the point of how the Florida Wildlife Corridor is relevant to the Florida Native Plant Society and our mission. So I just wanted to distinguish these handful of natural community types that are recognized by the state as being very significant for biodiversity protection. We know they're important for plant conservation, plant biodiversity protection. And so you can see this is probably the southern half of the O to O, what you're looking at here, extending northward from Ocala National Forest. And I have distinguished their areas that are in public conservation now, and which are also identified as approved Florida Forever project areas. There are some gaps, but there's a lot of land that's really important for protection that is already either in public ownership or targeted for protection through Florida Forever. One point here is, you see the Florida Wildlife Corridor is that kind of olive green, I guess it is. And you can see that these underrepresented natural communities, kind of like stepping stones, they're scattered throughout there. And I guess the point I would make is the Florida Wildlife Corridor, corridor implies it's for movement, but this provides important areas of habitat for native plants and native plant communities, the corridor itself. So it's not so much about plants moving, they're, as opposed to wildlife, we know plants have roots, not legs. And if you could advance to the next slide, please, Tom.
Yep.
And all I'm doing here, I've zoomed in. Again, that's that big red blob is the Ocala National Forest. And to represent here about Ocklawaha restoration and how important that is to really improving connectivity, functional connectivity at that southern end of the O to O. Again, this is Ocala National Forest. It extends northward more than 100 miles to Osceola National Forest. And that reservoir, that big area of blue, it might as well be a large border wall. It's not very permeable to movement by many wildlife species and certainly a lot of plant species. So if this O to O is going to function as a corridor for movement by wildlife and or plants, we really need to follow through on restoration. Next slide, please. I think this kind of tells a really important part of the story. The aerial image you see in the upper right, that is before dam construction. That's aerial imagery from 1964. And the dashed line outlines the boundaries of what is now Rodman Reservoir. The aerial imagery below it, that is after dam construction. That's pretty recent aerial imagery, but that's what this area has looked like ever since 1968, when they built that dam, shortly after the top image was taken. I also have embedded in there some of the former spring locations. Those are labeled Bright Angel Springs, Marion Blue Spring, which was one of the more significant springs in this area. But in total, 20 springs were basically drowned by this reservoir when that dam was constructed. So back in 1964, before dam, you see that image in the upper left. That isn't the Ocklawaha River, but it is a natural Florida river with floodplain forest. That's what we had before dam construction. After dam construction, we had what you see there in the lower left. Basically, we drowned 7,500 acres of floodplain forest under that reservoir. And every now and then you can see the remnants of it, because every 2 or 3 years, the reservoir is drained, I think about 8 feet, in order to just keep that system alive. And when that drainage happens, we're able to see those springs that were drowned. All of a sudden, they're able to flow again. We can see the remnants of the forest that pre-existed there. So bottom line, with restoration, we'll be able to restore 7,500 acres of floodplain forest that were essentially destroyed by that project. Next, and this will be the last slide that I have, this next one. I just wanted to also emphasize again about those spring systems. Cannon Springs is one of them. It's a little further upriver than the ones that you saw in that previous image, but it's one of those that when the reservoir is drained, when it goes through one of those drawdown periods, and you see it full up on the upper left. Then the image you see in the lower right with the canoeist, that's during a drawdown. And that is when paddlers really flock to this system, where they can actually see what was formerly the natural river channel, and explore where these springs were and still are when they're allowed to flow, when all that water above them is drawn down. So we have the opportunity to restore not just 7,500 acres of floodplain swamp, but also 20 spring systems and the spring run streams that were associated with them. And those kinds of systems we know are really important for a lot of listed plant species. I have a couple of them included here. Species like the endangered star anise and our beloved cardinal flower, all species that would finally have former habitat restored to them if we can basically breach the dam and drain the reservoir. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our next presenter. It might be Valerie. A few words to say.
Yep, that's me. So we're going to go upstream a little ways. The Deep Creek is a tributary of the Ocklawaha that was affected by the construction of the Rodman Reservoir. So I'm going to pull this topo over. So if you zoom out and switch to terrain, this is kind of the area we've been talking about. You guys can't see this, Tom and Jean, because I'm showing it over. But yep. We're going just north of the reservoir, and then it is, switch over to topo. So you can see that it's this creek that heads into the Ocklawaha and now into the Rodman Pool. So it's a climate refugia for plant species that are rare or absent throughout the rest of the peninsula of Florida. And it's most well known for being the only place in Florida, other than Mormon Branch, in the peninsular Florida, other than Mormon Branch of the Ocklawaha National Forest, that the majestic Atlantic white cedar occurs. Of course, there's much larger areas of Atlantic white cedar forests in the North Carolina coastal plain and in southern New Jersey. Botanist Robert Simmons visited the site in 1987, but it was at that time and continues to be in private ownership and is rarely botanically surveyed. So we had an opportunity to, as I was organizing this series, to organize this BioBlitz so that we could talk about what we maybe find something new and talk about the great treasures that the habitat could be improved with restoration for the Ocklawaha. So this is what's his name? He presented at our conference last year. Anyway, so what I did is I contacted Adam, president of Ixia chapter, and he helped arrange a series of very cool botanists, and you can see our little team there. And our best find of the trip, I think, is the next slide. Tom? Oh, not yet. Okay. So it's just a really beautiful creek and really botanically interesting. I mean, cedar forest is just not something you see. I mean, unless you visited Mormon Branch, it's just really mucky and clear water, tannic. Next slide. Yeah, so our best find of the trip was Florida willow, Salix floridana, which is state endangered, and that's in the top right there. And so that's one that was not actually on Bob Simmons' list. So really exciting find. Our second best find was the pale green orchid, Platanthera flava, which is state threatened. That photo is by Adam Saffels. The third best find was southern quillwort, here in the right-hand corner, Isoetes flaccida, which is uncommon. And swamp thistle, which is another climate refugia, and so is fairy wand here. It's not wanding, so it's not shooting up its flowering stalk, Chemularium luteum. And we had good results from this. So we had 154 observations, 90 species, and since we're all plant nerds, there were 80 plant species. So I really appreciate everybody who went out on the trip, and really looking forward to this area being restored.
Thank you. Gene?
And I would just point out that Deep Creek, if I'm correct in my geography, drains into what is now the north side of the reservoir.
Yep.
So it's essentially disconnected from the Ocklawaha by the reservoir at this point.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Valerie. And I also want to point out that I was both Margaret Spontak, who I think is on the phone with us, Valerie and Jean all had a very big role in putting this presentation together, as well as obviously this session as well. So I'm indebted to them getting this PowerPoint together. I contributed some of the slides, but it made it much easier for me to do this with everything else going on. So we're going to move on, and some of this will reiterate points that have already been made, but add some specifics. And there's a few new points that we're going to make in this last part of the presentation. So obviously the river, and specifically Deep Creek, but the river too, all that floodplain forest that used to exist, is really important floristically. It is also very important either directly or indirectly to a number of focal species. We're not going to talk about each of these species individually, but on the left here is a list of focal species, and I use the term focal as any species of conservation interest. Many of them are either federally or state listed or declining, meaning usually they're tracked by Florida Natural Areas Inventory. And you'll note, a lot of you know these species if you look over this list. Obviously Florida black bear, Florida panther, wide-ranging species, not necessarily habitat specific, more generalist, but they need large intact areas with less human activity, human influence. They're obviously primary focal species for the Ecological Greenways Network and the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And there are other types of area sensitive species that need larger areas, including swallowtail kites, eastern indigo snakes, even sandhill cranes that needs a diversity of habitat and has relatively large home ranges, fox squirrels, which have, compared to gray squirrels, much bigger home ranges and need pretty large areas to support viable populations, as well as a number of habitat-specific species. A lot of these species that you see may not live in the restored floodplain forest, but they're in those xeric habitats both to the north and the south. There is the possibility that some of these species might actually, in some cases, cross a restored floodplain forest versus they're unlikely to cross a large reservoir. So that's one potential direct value. And there are some xeric adapted species or that use xeric habitats most of the time, but they might use more mesic or even hydric habitats during droughts or seasonally, depending on their life history needs. So this is an incomplete list, but some of the major focal vertebrates that would benefit from restoration. And we're always trying to build coalitions, right? So some of us are not interested in hunting, but there are a lot of people out there that are, and we want to make the point that the restored Ocklawaha River system, especially restoring floodplain forests and juxtaposition between wetland and upland forest, could be important for a lot of game species, including alligators, dove, turkey, wild hog, and others. So that is another wildlife benefit of the corridor where there are places, either public or private, that are open to hunting. We're going to end with answering specific or discussing specific points about how partial restoration of the Ocklawaha River strengthens the Florida Wildlife Corridor. We've obviously covered this in a more general way. Now we're going to cover some specific points to end the presentation. First, this is completely new, although Gene referred to it in regards to paddlers loving to go to the springs during drawdowns, and that would be clearly continue and increasingly true with a restored river where those springs are always the way they used to be versus only during sort of like they used to be during a drawdown. And in general, it's very clear that overall that river restoration is going to improve public access for boating, shore fishing, hiking, camping, biking, and other types of outdoor recreation. One of the things that we like to talk about is visiting the dam site after restoration. You know, there's a new type of recreation, or at least nature appreciation. It's, being able to view an ecological restoration project, a landscape scale ecological restoration project. Those opportunities are rare because it's rare that we're able to do that kind of scale of habitat restoration. Well, the Ocklawaha River, where the reservoir is now, is going to be a restoration in progress for many, many, many years. And people will be able to go to the site, see how it's changing over time and returning to a primeval floodplain forest. This is also something that I've worked with Margaret Spontak in more detail. I am in a landscape architecture department at the University of Florida, although I'm a landscape ecologist and conservation biologist. Recreation is not my expertise, but it is one of the expertise that our students are supposed to learn, or skill sets they're supposed to learn as they go through our program. 2 years ago, I worked with Margaret to run a studio class with our senior undergraduates that all did projects addressing either the conservation benefits and or the recreational benefits of restoration. And so for more detail on this point, the first point that it would increase and improve recreational access, Margaret's put out a lot of material showcasing all the studio projects those students did 2 years ago. Then last year, Katie Stenberg did what's called a capstone. She wasn't in the studio because she was a year younger than that cohort 2 years ago, but she decided to do her capstone project, which is your final undergraduate project on restoration and how that might change the way the dam site itself could be used. And Margaret's also used that project extensively to show, the dam site today is, some people like to go and fish in the spillway. Well, that's going to change with restoration, but that site could be even better for recreation. And Katie's work shows that very clearly. And so if you're interested in any of that material, you can get it on the Restore Ocklawaha River website. And there's lots of good visual information, PowerPoints, and other materials that cover those various projects. Second point, we've already covered this one pretty extensively. It reestablishes a critical link in the Florida Wildlife Corridor. The fact is the reservoir sits right in the middle of the Odo corridor. Of course, we're more towards the southern end, but it is a potential barrier to wildlife movement, both at a local scale, but also this regional scale as well. Restoration would return about 7,500 acres of floodplain forest that would be easier for these animals to cross. For bears and panthers, it's also primary habitat where obviously the reservoir is not. It would reconnect a corridor or improve the functionality of the corridor for these and many other species. Also, partial restoration would have other benefits, that are specific to the steps in the process of partial restoration that are directly relevant to improving the quality and functionality of the corridor. Obviously, you're reducing the surface water, so you're taking an open water system that you see on the bottom of left, essentially a lake or reservoir, and turning it back into some of it will be herbaceous wetlands, but most of it will be forested wetlands and edges of uplands as well. That's important. Closing and securing Buckman Lock. Obviously, you're going to want aquatic species to use the historic river channel to move up and down the river instead of occasional use of some animals potentially getting through the lock at this point, including occasionally manatees. So Buckman Lock is on the canal that connects the reservoir to the St. Johns River. It's the way that boats get through currently because obviously they can't go through the dam. But that would be closed. We would be restoring the historic Ocklawaha channel by filling parts of the barge canal where it intersects with the river. We would be restoring the historic Deep Creek channel flow all the way to the historic river channel. There'd have to be some work on the historic river channel to stabilize it. And then, like Katie, I talked about Katie Stenberg doing the project of repurposing Kirkpatrick Dam. Partial restoration calls for removal of only a small portion of the dam, not the entire berm or dam, but there are ways to take advantage of the remaining dam to make it a recreational amenity. And then about 2,000 feet of the berm would be removed to restore the historic river channel. And by doing that, this is similar to the map that Gene showed earlier. By doing that, you're restoring or greatly improving ecological connectivity across both the reservoir, and these arrows are generally pointing at, and here you can see Deep Creek, but it's allowing better animal movement from the Ocala Forest to the northwest, the north, northeast. Same thing with the canal, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Animals today probably are more likely to go around the east side of Rodman Reservoir, but the canal itself is still a bit of a barrier. It's pretty steep-sided, it's fairly open, and restoring portions of that canal would also have a benefit for north-south wildlife movement. And so I'm on record, this is just a quote that is used, that yes, my opinion is that restoring the Ocklawaha River would have a significant habitat connectivity benefit for wide-ranging other landscape-dependent species, as well as more specific habitat benefits and local connectivity benefits for certain focal species. Other examples of the importance of restoration includes that it's going to restore significant habitat types. We've covered this. There's some people who like to fish in Rodman. We know that. But lake type habitat, open water, freshwater habitat is not necessarily a rare habitat type. Now, the devil's in the details. There are certain types of lakes, specific lakes, that are relatively rare, but this kind of open water habitat is not rare. Whereas the floodplain forest of the Ocklawaha River is relatively unique or quite unique floristically and in terms of animal biodiversity. It is a rare habitat type, and we would be restoring thousands of acres of everything from swamp forest types that are more dependent on water and are flooded more regularly to more almost mesic, still a hydric community, but floodplain forest further up the slope and adjacent to both the xeric communities along the southern border of the river and then the flatwoods, but also patches of scrub and sandhill on the north side of the river. And if you've ever been here, if you've ever gone to any of the road crossings of the Cross Florida Greenway and the Ocklawaha River, if you traverse from the river channel upslope the Ocala National Forest, that's a very unique system because it's this very fast, high gradient that goes up a steep slope where you have a change in natural communities from river to swamp to floodplain forest to mesic to xeric very quickly. And that gradient is important for a lot of wildlife species. So that gets us back to this idea of regaining habitat and wildlife diversity. One of the things that we talk about in Florida and elsewhere is wherever you can do it, protecting and restoring a functional habitat gradient from freshwater aquatic and wetland systems to high and dry xeric systems is going to will do a better job of protecting habitat for a range of species, as well as be a more functional wildlife corridor. And specific points include that we're gaining lots of floodplain and swamp forests, but not as appreciated as much. We would be restoring a functional juxtaposition of forested wetlands and forested uplands, as well as other types of natural communities. In Florida, functional interactions between fire in those uplands and flooding in those wetlands is an important way to create certain types of diversity where there's both fire and flooding that could be restored in the protected parts of this system where you're using prescribed fire on the edge of floodplains and forested wetlands and other types of wetlands. We already talked about the fact that for fox squirrels and some other species, that the floodplain forests and wetlands can be a habitat refuge for certain upland dependent species during times of drought, or in some cases, places to breed. And there's a number of focal species that would directly benefit that we've already discussed. One that we haven't discussed, obviously very good wood stork habitat. We might increase the amount of bald eagle nesting habitat. Eastern indigos love to use both uplands and wetlands, so this would be really good for that species, etc. Number 5, the aquatic connectivity. So I mentioned at the very beginning that it's not just this corridor across the river south to north, but it's also the river itself as a wildlife corridor for both terrestrial and aquatic species. We know that the dam and even though there's some movement of animals through the barge canal and Buckman Lock, that a restored river is going to restore aquatic connectivity that historically has been important. We expect there to be a lot of manatees taking advantage of the various springs all the way up to Silver Springs and beyond. And there are a number of fish species that have become very rare or absent in the Ocklawaha River system, as well as in Silver Springs, including striped bass, sturgeon, various species of catfish, American shad and hickory shad that would both likely breed in the river if they could go further up, and as well as American eel that also, in that case, lives in freshwater, but then has to move downstream to breed in the Atlantic Ocean. This is a specific example of changing the zoom in of the canal. So this is Buckman Lock. And again, trying to build a coalition, the plan or the proposal is that the areas west of Buckman Lock, restoring that, where you either fill the entire barge canal west of Buckman Lock, or you fill parts of it to restore terrestrial connectivity in an area that used to be flatwoods and some xeric natural communities and wetlands all in a matrix. And then the goal for the eastern half of the barge canal and Buckman Lock is the possibility of increasing access to the St. Johns River, having a boat launch facility and other recreational facilities associated with the lock, although the lock would be closed. So the water access would only be from the lock northeast to the river. And then number 7, this idea of buffers. We know that Ocklawaha River is largely surrounded by natural and rural lands, and that's important for the river, but it's also important to protect buffers for our military bases. Camp Blanding is extremely important for conservation for a number of species, including red-cockaded woodpeckers, fox squirrels, etc. But to continue to do the training that they do, they need buffers from intensive development so they can do live fire training and all kinds of other things. So the military is a really important partner for protecting buffers that help protect wildlife corridors and all this habitat that's really important for restoring this corridor and restoring habitat for all these focal species that we're talking about as well. So in summary, we expect that there would be improved, or we know there would be improved public access for outdoor recreation, that restoring the river and getting rid of the reservoir would reestablish a critical link in the Florida Wildlife Corridor by increasing functionality, the opportunity for animals to move north and south across the river through the corridor, as well as local areas connecting xeric habitat north and south of the river. You're going to restore a lot of significant ecosystems, natural communities, habitat types. We're going to regain species and wildlife diversity, really important for restoring the aquatic ecosystems of the river and Silver Springs. And this idea of buffering, having a large intact system. And this gets back to one of the points Gene makes. You have all those xeric patches of habitat, our natural communities, that we want to keep those in a natural, semi-natural matrix versus them being surrounded by development so that they can function in a variety of ways they need to as part of a functional matrix. I think that's it. I think this last slide, I think there's two more slides actually, I'm sorry. So this is all about imagining a restored river. Restoring the river would take some money, but the concept, the partial restoration, is actually pretty easy. It's breaching the dam in a way that makes sense structurally in terms of engineering, and a lot of this restoration of habitat that would happen, most of it's going to happen naturally with some help from us, but most of it happened just by drawing down the reservoir. I think this is the last slide.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. As usual, fantastic.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. And one of the follow-ups is, if anybody, I think, Valerie, feel free to give people my email address. If anybody has any specific questions about points I covered in this presentation, wants to talk to me about anything else, I admit that I get lots of emails, and so I'm not always super timely about responding, but please feel free to email me, contact me if you'd like to learn anything more related to the corridor, or specifically the corridor and river restoration.
Yes, we do have I will post your email in the chat. We do have a request for the slides.
That's fine with me. I think Margaret would, I mean, if we're all okay with that, that's fine with me.
Okay, so why don't I check with Margaret? I told Emily to email me, and if that's okay with Margaret, then we will put them in a Dropbox or a Google Drive link and put them in the description once they're uploaded. And if you email me at communications@fnps.org, I can also get those to you.
And next week we'll have Casey Fitzgerald with us, if I'm not mistaken, picking up and expounding on what Tom was explaining about the benefits of restoration to aquatic species.
We do have so there is a question in the chat. RJ asks if we could address the loss of life of aquatic creatures, specifically manatees, with the Loxon Dam, and that will be expounded upon quite a bit more next week, but if you have anything to say on that, Tom.
Well, I will, disclaimer, I'm not a manatee expert, but I do know that there are manatees that have been stuck in the loch. There have been mortalities. Obviously, manatees are a interesting management consideration. I mean, they'll be in the river, and there's still going to be some motorboat use of the river, but there are a number of ways to manage manatee, access to the springs, making the springs refuges for manatees, to make sure that any potential conflict with manatee safety and well-being is managed in a restored river. But the loch is an important impact, and more importantly, a few manatees get through, but not nearly as many as would with a restored river to access all that thermal refuge and other habitat benefits that the river would have if we were to breach the dam.
Thank you. All right. Well, those are all the questions in the chat. So I will just invite everyone back next week. Again, another public lunch and learn. So please share it with your friends and family and people who may be interested. I'll get that in an email to our members here next, probably on Monday. So keep an eye out on your inbox. And Tom, I just really appreciate you weighing in on this important issue and always being willing to give us excellent presentations.
You're welcome, and thank you so much for putting this together and all the hard work Valerie, Eugene, and Margaret did to put the presentation together. You know, I'll help. I have too many projects, but I'll help however I can.
Yeah, I know you do. And obviously, we didn't discuss really what you can do to help this effort, but Margaret does talk about it in the Lunch and Learn last week. So if you are interested, go ahead to the last 15 minutes of that, and she addresses it. So, and she's open to contact if you would like to join in on our calls or anything. So, all right. Thanks, everyone.
I'll just say, as policy and legislation chair, we will be recruiting our membership when the time comes to help us make this restoration a reality. So thanks for everybody for tuning in.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Bye, guys.